Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our second in a panel series on law and evidence of self-managed abortion. My name is Patty Skooster, and I'm here to share some words of welcome and introduction before I pass it along to Farah Diaz-Tello, who will be moderating and giving an introduction to this panel. Together, we, that is Adrienne Garashi, Heidi Moseson, Farah, and Lucia Berra Pizarrosa, all came together to organize this panel series, a series of virtual discussions with experts. And we think we have some incredible ones on how the law and empirical evidence on self-managed abortion relate to each other across disciplines, across countries around the world. And the series is co-sponsored by our respective organizations, IBIS Reproductive Health, IFWA and HOW, Lawyering for Reproductive Justice, the O'Neill Institute at Georgetown Law. I'm affiliated with Temple Law School and the Center for Public Health Law Research. I want to mention here that in a month or so, we'll be releasing legal data that tracks law on abortion across the states, so look out for that. This is our second panel in this series, again, looking at law and evidence on self-managed abortion. Stay tuned for upcoming panels likely to happen in the next year as we move forward, or within the next year before the end of the year. We'll examine legal risk in panel number 3. And in panel number 4, start to think about new directions for self-managed abortion as we look toward the future. Information on the series and recordings of the first panel are available on the panel on the series landing page, and I'll drop in the chat a link to that page. You'll find the recording for this one there as well once we've held it. And we're really delighted to have our panelists. And now it's time for me to turn it over to Farah, who will give us introductions and kick us off.
Thank you so much, Patty. Thank you for the warm introduction. Welcome, and thank you to all of you for spending your time today with us. My name is Farah Diaz-Tello, and I'm Senior Counsel and Legal Director at IFWA and HOW, Lawyering for Reproductive Justice, a US-based legal advocacy organization. And it's my honor today to facilitate a conversation about the ways in which the law, and specifically restrictions on abortion provision, drive self-managed abortion. Self-managed abortion is not a new phenomenon. It is a fact of human existence. And whatever the law says about abortion, people will find ways to end pregnancies when they need to do so. It has become increasingly clear that people's reasons for seeking self-managed abortion may stem from a range of circumstances and experiences. Our speakers today come from a diverse array of contexts around the world and will show us how much we have in common and how much we have to learn from one another in the global effort for reproductive freedom. So we have Dr. Suchitra Dalvi. She is a gynecologist who has been working in the development sector for over 2 decades. She's the coordinator of the Asia Safe Abortion Partnership. We have Dr. Heidi Moseson. She is an epidemiologist whose research focuses on measuring experiences of self-managed abortion and models of care. She's a senior research scientist at IBIS Reproductive Health. And Wanjiru Karepi is a Kenyan human rights lawyer and researcher. She's currently the co-coordinator of the Lawyers Network supporting self-managed abortion activism throughout Africa. She's been working in the sexual and reproductive health and rights spaces, both focused on the African region and internationally for over 12 years. So we've structured this conversation around 3 basic questions that we're going to pose to all of our panelists to invite them to answer. And then at the end, we'll have an opportunity for Q&A with you, our audience members. And I encourage you to put any questions you have in the Q&A, and we'll answer them as we reach the end of our presentation. So the first question to all of our panelists, which we'll turn over to Suchitra first, is please provide us with a brief overview of the context in which you work and the drivers of self-managed abortion.
Thank you so much, Farah, and thanks, Patty, and all the organizers for the opportunity to be here and speak on this very important topic. I think post-COVID, we have realized the critical importance of understanding the politics of self-managed abortion. I really appreciate what you said, Farah. In my opinion, abortion has always been self-managed. What we are really looking at now is safer self-managed options. and how we can support those through a collaborative system of service delivery. The context from which, my perspective is built is from the work across Asia. So the Asia Safe Abortion Partnership has members and partners in over 25 countries across the region. And a lot of the work that we do is informed by the country context and the testimonies and stories and case studies that we hear from our country members. As you may be aware, Asia currently has the largest number of young people it has ever had in its population. And this in itself has created a kind of a demographic window where there are a much higher number of unwanted pregnancies in any case. We also have a situation where there's a deeply entrenched patriarchal socio-cultural context with a lot of increasing religious and political conservatism. We are also in many countries in a way, held back by laws which are based on very archaic penal codes, most of which we inherited from colonizers. So there's the whole post-colonial, law reform conversation still to be had. There is a high amount of forced and early marriages happening in the region. There is very little formal or even informal information on sex and sexuality and contraception. There is a lot of intimate partner violence. So in the context of all these, it is not surprising that there is a very high amount of unwanted pregnancies. There is a lack of public sector services which women can approach without being judged or without being treated badly. The private sector is expensive. So really, I would say these put together are very much the drivers of why women would seek self-managed abortion. Not necessarily because they wanted self-managed, but because they're really left with no other place to go to, which is offering them a solution to the unwanted pregnancy in a way that's dignified, that's safe, that's effective, that's affordable. So that's just sort of brief highlights to respond to your question.
Thank you very much for providing that context. So we'll pass the same question to Heidi next.
Thanks, Farah. And also, it's great to be here with everyone. So echoing what you said, Dr. Dalvi and Farah agreed that self-managed abortion is a practice that has always been self-managed. It started that way, and even particularly medication abortion, which many of us talk about when we talk about self-managed abortion, originally was discovered through self-managed use in Brazil and elsewhere. In terms of the context in which the work that I do, I'm a researcher. I study self-managed abortion experiences. A lot of the work that we do is outside of the US, and also given I'm a US-based panelist in this session, can speak to the context in the US in which we see self-managed abortion occurring. Echoing the patriarchy that you described, Dr. Dalvi, in the United States, we certainly find ourselves in an increasingly extremist Christian, white supremacist state. I think the overturning of the protections for abortion via Roe v. Wade that we saw in June from the Supreme Court is kind of one of the latest manifestations of that. So in terms of abortion access, the context in the United States is bleak, I would say. And I also think this is a panel on self-managed abortion and the law. And it feels important to mention that even when we had constitutional protections in place in the United States, as we see in many countries, even where abortion is legal, self-managed abortion still occurs, has always occurred, and I think will always occur. And so understanding this tension of certainly there are legal drivers of self-managed abortion when people legally cannot access clinical care. We see in the United States, as these laws have sort of unrolled, we've measured increases in demand for self-managed medication abortion. So certainly laws play a role, but I think it's also really important to talk about when we think about drivers of self-managed abortion, it's a lot more than just the law. Laws are sort of not enough. Where abortion is legal, it's not enough. And thinking about there's as many reasons for self-managed abortion as there are people who self-manage. I think a lot of whether you self-manage depends, and why depends on who you are and your circumstances. So some of the research that I've been a part of, that my colleagues and an organization have been a part of, have been looking at networks of self-described feminist activists who provide access to and support through self-managed medication abortion. And increasingly we're also studying the role of that sort of activism in the United States. We're looking at experiences based on sort of not monolith, highly diverse within, but particular umbrella groups of people who have faced greater barriers to abortion care. So transgender, non-binary, gender expansive people in the United States, reasons for experiences of self-managed abortion. Similarly, looking at among different racial and ethnic identities in the United States. We have a large project on AAPI experiences of abortion in the United, of self-managed abortion and abortion in the United States. Did a large project with Black women in primarily the South of the US. So I think just to name some of those as a highlight of, again, there's lots of different circumstances around self-managed abortion, and excited to talk more about that today.
Thank you, Heidi. And we'll pass the same question to Manjuru.
Thank you once again. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. And a lot of what has been said can be echoed from an African context in which I work. So I want to talk a little bit about the organization that I work for. I work with MAMA. MAMA Network is, first, MAMA stands for Mobilizing Activists Around Medical Abortion. And what we do is collaborate with grassroots organizations, community organizations, feminists in Africa around transforming the landscape on reproductive health care, specifically introducing medical abortion as safe, accessible, and effective. And so the reason why this network was created is mobilizing against, destigmatizing abortion, fostering women empowerment, and then we advance women's autonomy and by sharing information on self-managed abortion, access to abortion with pills, and basically working within the contexts that are extremely restrictive in the countries that we work. We are a membership organization. We have 54 organizations across about 22 countries in Africa. So I run the I coordinate the legal support network along with Lucia, and I think what I would like to talk about a little bit different, the context in Africa about why the drivers of abortion in Africa are so high. So first we'll start with the restrictive legal regime in Africa. We start with the local laws, right? And that is extremely restrictive when it comes to constitutional provisions, it comes to the penal code and sentencing guidelines. You're also talking about restrictions in relation to access to medications and particularly these pills, right? And the laws that govern those. And then we talk about the crimes related to assisting anyone who wants to access this, and restrictions to access to information. So in Africa, there's quite a number of restrictions around all these things. So what are the issues? What are the issues that come up apart from like just the restrictive laws? We can talk about morality. Morality is a big issue about whether it's right or whether it's wrong. And of course, from a religious context, but also from an ethical consideration. And then we cannot get around the elephant in the room, which is of course colonization and the importation of colonial laws, which are extremely endemic to Africa. Because if you look at African context, you will find that abortion actually was there. There were ways in which we did in Africa way prior to this. But then of course, when you bring colonization and the laws that are important because of legal pluralism, then you have a whole other subset of issues that we have to deal with. Now, also we talk about political power and the politicization of the abortion conversation that makes it extremely difficult for women to, and young girls, and the numbers in Africa are super alarming on accessing self-managed abortion or even just abortion care as a general principle, right? So we have that. And of course, gender roles and patriarchy being the biggest conversation in Africa, and how clans and tribes look at what you can do in relation to female autonomy, who can control your body. A lot of times you'll find that your husband or your partner is the one who has control over the body, and that really drives this conversation around abortion in Africa. So just to kind of give you an idea of numbers and how we think about numbers and how we think about the law. So the law extremely limits abortion, like prohibits it in certain countries. So 10 countries prohibit abortion outright, and then they limit the ambit in which abortion can run. So for example, whether it's to save the life of a woman or to preserve her physical health. They don't even talk about mental health, they're limited to just physical health. And this, of course, once you think about rights to privacy and access and so on and so forth, then you see the numbers going higher because I cannot go to hospital, I cannot get the drugs, and I don't want to deal with the social stigma around it. So what am I going to do? I'm just going to resort to managing it at home. And the organization that I work for, and we partner with the grassroots organization, ensure that there's access right, to these pills directly to the people. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later when we come up to those kind of conversations. So yeah, a bit of context on Africa.
Thank you for that context. And so now that we have all, we've gotten a little bit of background from everybody of what you're seeing with the context that you're working in, I'm going to shift us to interventions. So what interventions are you undertaking or are you studying for our researchers to ensure people's access to abortion care? And the question first to Suchitra.
Right. Thanks for that, Farah. So as I said, the Asia Safe Abortion Partnership is an advocacy network, and we have country-level members and partners with whom we work. So a large part of the work that we do is in capacity building. So exactly some of the things that came up right now, building capacity of particularly young people to work as advocates for their own rights. So we have this program where we have youth champions, and we take them through an intensive 3-day program where we talk about gender, power, patriarchy, the legal context, in which safe abortions are happening, physical access, clinical services. So capacity building is one big part. The other one is knowledge creation and dissemination. So we have, translated the relevant parts of the WHO guidance, for example, and we have a medical abortion fact sheet, which is now out in 9 languages. It's also available as an audio book for those who have, visual impairment. And we are working to have it available in sign language for those who are, not able to read it in other languages. So we are working to improve access to the information. We have also been supporting telephone helplines in some of the countries. And these telephone helplines have been managed by young feminists on a more or less voluntary basis. And they are able to give information based on the WHO guidance on, how one could safely use misoprostol. And this is particularly in country contexts which are either have a lot of conflict or, it could actually be dangerous to go to a doctor and try to seek an abortion, even within the context of the very restrictive law. Because we know that there are some countries which say abortion is allowed only to save the life of the woman. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the service provider you find will have an expansive understanding of what it means to save your life. It's not that easy, even if the law says that. The other ways that we are contributing is there is a crowdsourced forum called Gynopedia, which we have been working on in order to provide information, whatever is safely available to share openly in terms of public sector spaces and say the brand names of the medical abortion pills that could be made available. So those are kind of the interventions that we've been doing. But primarily, as I said, the work happens through advocacy at country level. So the country advocacy networks are the ones who look at responding to legal restrictions or engaging with policymakers at country level. And of course, the other role we play is, participating in a meeting like this, where we bring the Asian perspective and the Asian context to a global dialogue. Thanks.
Thank you. Heidi, same question.
Thanks. So as a researcher, my angle at this question is more thinking about the interventions that we're measuring and studying. And in many instances, again, increasingly in the US context where I work increasingly, is the interventions that we're studying are these restrictions on abortion access, legal barriers to abortion access, and understanding how does that impact people's pathways, people's ability to access care, and people's lives. I think something that's been a part of a lot of conversations that we're having as a team, that we're having with our researcher colleagues too, is feeling that we are, and knowing we are in a space where we have decades of research on the harms of legal restrictions on abortion access. We know that laws that ban access to abortion or in any way chip away at it or restrict it are harmful for people's health, their emotional well-being, their just their ability to achieve their life goals. Really everything we've measured about the impact of abortion on people's lives, we know that restricting access to abortion is harmful. So there's like this deep frustration, I will say, to put it nicely, in terms of feeling like, okay, we're in a space of these restrictions. We don't need more research in some ways documenting the harms of this. We know it's harmful. So causing us to think a little more expansively about what is the role for research right now. If we already know that this is bad, yes, demonstrating how bad it is can be an effective tool for hopefully bringing evidence to bear in the political process and overturning some of the laws that we're seeing being rolled out across the world. But also, I think it has to be more than that. If we are having touch points as researchers with people who are seeking care in a restrictive environment, who are considering self-manage either proactively as a preference or out of a lack of access to clinical care, there are some things we know help people to have safe abortions and to access the absolute, their right to bodily autonomy. So what are we doing as researchers to make sure people have that information? It could be a part of, in the research survey materials, you are providing information on resources and how to access care. And I think for, people trained in research, can be this tension of like, oh, well, does that muddy the research design? If we're giving people information, are we changing their experience? And I think the answer is yes. But again, we know that there's some harm here. And so by providing people information on options for safe self-management, including information on legal risks, we can measure new pathways to care and understand what people need in order to access safe care when they're armed with the right information. So that just feels like an important point as we think about the role of research right now and understanding the impact of legal restrictions on abortion care. I'm happy to talk about sort of a few examples of that. I think other interventions that we have studied as part of that include, we've done a lot of work looking at accompaniment networks, which I mentioned, safe abortion hotlines, to understand what's the safety and effectiveness of people's experience of self-managed abortion when they're given information, when they're given counseling and guidance throughout a self-managed medication abortion. Particularly also in later abortion. I think there's later later is not that helpful of a term, but people do self-manage their abortions. We've worked with people up to 24 weeks, I think, and beyond. And so understanding what are the unique needs of people who are self-managing, beyond the first 10 weeks of pregnancy, and what are the interventions that exist to support them, and where we see that interventions are effective and safe, how can those be expanded? I'll stop there.
There's a lot more to dig into during our Q&A. And I'll pass the question to Majira.
Thank you. So a lot of what we do has also been mirrored in the different contexts that have already been spoken about, but I just want to talk about a little bit about what Mama Network does. So Lucia pioneered the legal support network within the Mama Network that I had mentioned earlier. And what we do is a variety of things. The first thing we do is we train lawyers in the different countries in which the Mama Network works. So we can do a couple of things. Just because you're a lawyer, like Dr. Dalby mentioned, it doesn't mean that you understand the legal complexities when it comes to abortion. So we train them specifically on abortion and abortion care and what the laws and restrictions around it and how we can provide urgent care for people who find themselves in conflict with the law. So we also have funds that we put aside so that when our members or anyone comes in conflict with the law, we are able to immediately intervene so that they don't have to worry too much about the situation that they find themselves in. Like Dr. Heidi mentioned, we also have work around research projects because access to information is extremely important. Once you have numbers, then you're able to then create policy around those numbers and you can be able to show the access that is needed, for example, for safe abortion care. We develop risk assessment toolkits so that you can identify the risks. What are the risks to you? What are the threats? What are your vulnerabilities? And how can you mitigate these risks that you find yourself in? Can you create a safety protocol, a security protocol within your organization, but also with the grassroots members that we are working with directly? We try to facilitate conversations like Dr. Dalby mentioned, cross-regionally. So we invite people from different regions, for example, from Latin America, because they're very advanced in how they look at interventions, and we want to learn from that. So best practice and understanding how we can integrate that into our own particular situation in Africa. Another thing we do is, of course, we provide information because the idea is to demystify what abortion is and access to reproductive health care for young girls specifically who do not understand completely the context, and you find yourself with an unwanted pregnancy and worrying about the situation that you find yourself in. So we try to demystify abortion and safe abortion health care and access to this with pills and so on and so forth. The hotlines that you both mentioned, we have that as well, pioneered by Mama Network. We have hotlines where you can call in and get access to information, which is extremely important when you're thinking about using SMA, specifically particular pills. In Africa, you'll find misoprostol or mifeprostol. So you have to know how to use them, and we try to provide this particular information. Obviously, we try to ensure that we offer capacity building, whether it's to our lawyers that are offering the legal help, or it's to, for example, the service providers, right? So whether it's the pharmacists, whether it's the medical doctors, we need them to understand what parameters each can work and how they can ensure that we are providing safe abortion healthcare to different people. Finally, we work on building movement, right? So not just necessarily about demystification, but also just around the WHO guidelines, like Dr. Dalvi mentioned, trying to make sure that it's accessible in different languages and that people can be able to read and understand what access means and what it looks like and how can you do this, destigmatize patriarchy and have conversations around colonization and how that has also kind of created a complexity around abortion that is not supposed to be the narrative that we find ourselves. And within this, of course, we have conversations around reform and how that looks like. And so Mama Network has a variety of different strategies, but also because we have multiple organizations working on these issues, then you have different areas of strategic multi-tiered interventions that we can engage with, right, which we can talk about a little bit later.
Thank you all for sharing those interventions. And so the entire topic of our panel is how the law drives self-managed abortion. But it's really an interplay between the law and people's experiences of self-managed abortion and the ways that they access abortion and back to the law. So the interventions that you have described, how are they shaping the policy landscape in your context? And we'll start again with Suchitra.
Thanks for that. So as I said, the work that happens in terms of shaping policies happens at country level. So as a regional network, of course, we offer the support, whether it is technical or, through advocacy and capacity building. But one of the interventions which we have been engaging proactively is working with medical students. While that may not directly shape policy now, we feel that this is a cohort of healthcare providers who are going to be sensitized to the gender and rights perspective of safe abortion. And maybe 5 years or 10 years down the line, they're going to be in places in the healthcare system in order to be able to move the way a safe abortion service is provided, so that it's done in a dignified, safe and effective and rights-based approach. So that's definitely one of the interventions we think is going to be very important in the future. The other is, whenever we talk about self-managed abortion, I think there is a politics of self-managed abortion, which we always presence in any conversation. Aside from, of course, the background, as we have said, there's post-colonial penal code, there's patriarchy, there's religious conservatism, etc. But the fact remains that women manage natural miscarriages all the time. 20 to 25% of all pregnancies end in a miscarriage anytime between 1 to 3 to 4 months. And if women are able to manage those, we can definitely trust women to manage medical abortion. Because although, as you said, some pregnancies may go, need to be terminated a little later, say up to 24 weeks or even beyond. But the vast majority of terminations are taking place in the first trimester. So, presencing that very much. And the other is we talk about the fact that for healthcare providers, again, in a way, it's a moral responsibility. It's not just a biomedical provision. If you are witness to someone's sexual and reproductive health rights violation, and we know that there are many doctors who believe that conscientious objection should be allowed. So some of us are presencing the conversation that if that is so, then conscientious provision should also be allowed. Which means if a doctor believes in good faith that if I deny this woman, she will die, and I cannot allow her to die from an unsafe abortion, I should be equally protected to provide a safe abortion, no matter what the context of the law. Because if you're not allowing me that, then really it's a very one-sided understanding of my conscience. So we are trying to presence these conversations because while they may not have direct impact on policy, as you said quite rightly, that, even if the law changes, I think until you have a service provider interacting with the woman or the pregnant person at some point, the service providers will necessarily have a lot of power. So we're trying to work through that and through the professional networks in order to shift policy. And I think also in terms of self-managed abortion, there are many components of the abortion, even if some of them could be self-managed, would go a long way in improving women's access to safe abortion. And in fact, I wrote out a list so I don't forget any of the pieces. One is self-assessment of pregnancy and gestational age, self-procurement of the pills, self-administration of the pills in location of choice, self-conducting the process like a natural miscarriage, self-assessment of complications either through a checklist that's made available along with the pills or some other method, self-referral to facilities as needed. And the important political perspective we bring really is that we don't want to reach a point where self-managed abortions are seen as, oh, you know, women can self-manage, let them go ahead and do it. It should be available as a valid choice within the context of a sensitive and if safe and effective and accessible public health service delivery system. So it's not an abrogation of responsibilities of the government. They're like, okay, you know, that's fine, let them self-manage. That's not the approach. So the politics is it has to be available as a choice. There may be women who choose not to. There may be women who, even given the choice of self-managed, may want to be supervised by someone who's qualified and trained, and in a facility they feel safe. So that's kind of the sort of overall, I would say, end game probably of the way we look at approaching self-managed abortions in the future. Thanks.
Heidi, that's on to you.
Thank you. I love that concept of conscientious provision. I like the way you frame this question, Farah, in terms of it doesn't just go one way. You know, sure, laws can drive self-managed abortion, but there's also this interplay of the other direction. And I think I sort of have a cynical perspective on it, or I don't know if cynical, it just more negative realities of it. And then there's also sort of a positive frame as well. For instance, to give examples from the United States, I think what we've seen recently is we have this history of most of the laws related to abortion are designed and constructed to restrict access. And I think we see that in a lot of parts of the world. So there's the laws do not feel rooted in science. The laws do not feel rooted in research evidence. They are, the lawmakers often admit directly to that, setting aside the evidence as they make their legal decisions. But I do think, so there's some sort of rejection of the importance of the laws, given if these laws do not even pretend to have people's health and best interests at heart, there's some disengagement with the import of those laws. At the same time, they govern the way we live our lives. They lead to criminalization, so we have to comply with them in some circumstances. But I think what we see in the United States, for instance, communities take care of each other. We see this all over the world. And in sometimes the law sort of tries to catch up to that in harmful ways, where we've seen in the United States, again, as with elsewhere, but I'm just giving the US as an example. For instance, in the state of Texas, after the ban was imposed in September 2021, we saw, increases in requests for mail medication abortion by mail. And then we saw laws follow that to ban mailing of medication abortion bills. So communities creatively understanding what their needs are, navigating their legal risks, navigating what's best with local knowledge and coming up with solutions, and then seeing a restrictive policy regime step in to try to cut off those solutions. So that's a horrible, miserable way, I think, that some of these interventions can drive policy. In a more positive way, I think I saw a question in the chat, and I don't want the takeaway from what I said to suggest we don't need research on the harms of these restrictions, because for better or for worse, I think it is still important to document how harmful these restrictions are, but I think that needs to be coupled with research that focuses on tools we think or know could expand access, and doing research to measure how, if we do this thing, how many more people can access care, or what barriers does this remove for people? And I think, again, to the more positive direction of interventions shaping policy, the hope is that if we can document the public health benefits of these things, the wider benefits of certain interventions, then maybe that could lead to policy shift in places where there's non-extremist ideologues making policy. So I think that's at a high level sort of how I see some of these interventions shaping policy. And I think coming back to self-managed abortion, particularly self-managed abortions with medications, there is a robust body of research over a very long time, both in sort of peer-reviewed scientific settings and also from decades of experience and knowledge from activists on the ground and people who have self-managed, that it is medically safe and effective. But legal risks do remain in many settings. And so part of how we see the contours of policy shaping people's lives, I think will continue to follow this interplay of seeing how are communities responding to take care of themselves, to provide access to safe self-managed abortion, and who are the people in charge in terms of policy, and how are they reacting to those solutions.
Yes, thank you. Manjiro, on to you.
Thank you. So a lot of the policy interventions, it's so interesting when I listen to the different contexts, because I feel it's so mirrored in what we do in the work that I do at the Mama Network. So first I wanted to talk about how policy has already started shifting. And from a legal perspective, what we're seeing is with strategic litigation, right? Looking at cases that have already been taken to court and have been litigated on access to abortion. And for example, in my country, Kenya, we have come up with fantastic jurisprudence. There was a case that was recently concluded in 2022, and the jurisprudence around that has really changed the narrative on abortion, for example, in my country, right? So you're saying that in this particular context, we're saying that abortion is now essentially a healthcare requirement. And so that changes completely all the narratives that come thereafter, because now you cannot claim that, oh, you know what, this is illegal, this is not this, because jurisprudence is now starting to change that. So from that perspective, that is really helping to change the policy landscape, jurisprudence that's coming out from these particular cases. So apart from strategic litigation, we have partnering with particular actors. So partnering with Ministry of Health, partnering with proponents, for example, for self-managed abortion, but also safe abortion care. In our Court of Appeal, we have a judge who pioneered one of our laws here around access to not necessarily abortion, but sexual reproductive health and rights. And so having actors like those sitting in particularly very high levels of society, then creating narratives and conversations and kind of pushing back on the legal jurisprudence around this and saying, no, this is not right, this doesn't work in relation to autonomy, then that really helps. Also, kind of talking about the regional provisions around safe abortion and healthcare and provision of sexual reproductive health rights around abortion. So we have the Maputo Protocol, which is fantastic around that, and popularizing that by either creating narratives in which we can be able to talk about it, and that changes how within local jurisdictions you're looking at abortion and abortion care. So for example, we have, most countries in Africa have a system in which we must domesticate whatever international principles and regional situations there are. So you have to domesticate. That means you're creating conversations around that narrative. So almost all countries in Africa have some form of ratification or acceptance around international law. So whether it's CEDAW, ICCPR, and so on and so forth, and all the general comments around that. So pushing that narrative to change the landscape. So, okay, we have this, we have ratified this particular international convention, and we now domesticate it. And so we're pushing towards that within the Legal Support Network. And once again, we had talked about information and just having information around that being publicized and then changing the narrative. Now, another thing is legal awareness within the empowered community. So within the member communities that we're talking to and we're training and we're capacity building, when you have those conversations, for example, with universities, right? Legal students who are coming out from university, social science students coming out from university, medical students coming out from university, having a paradigm shift around what it looks like to have SMA and have self-managed abortion being accessible, pills being accessible, pharmacists having conversations with pharmacists, that already changes our policy landscape, because when they're sitting down to maybe work within the Ministry of Health or partner with these particular organizations that are working around this, then you have a paradigm shift, and that in itself comes out in the laws, the policies, the sub-policies that are also being created. Another thing is agency, right? Working with coalitions, working with networks around. So working, for example, with Dr. Dalby's network and working with Latin American communities, just having that narrative and changing that, bridging those gaps in information knowledge, like Heidi said, having more published information allows us to think and to change and to define the context and to change the context as we write and as we create this public, whether it's medical or even just from an advocacy perspective. So with the Mama Network, we do it both. So you have your medical journals that are being published, but you also have your narratives changing in advocacy and advocacy principles. And finally, just ensuring that we're also pushing around decriminalization and decriminalization conversations in specific contexts in specific countries, right? And that really helps to change narrative. So it might not change today, but as you can see, it's actually changing today. But with narrative, it changes now for the future as we go ahead. So that, I mean, really allows us to kind of think about that and yeah, have good changes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you all so much for sharing your insights. Now is the moment for our audience to get to ask the questions that have been sparked by all of you. I see that we already have a couple in the Q&A. I may throw in an additional question there. The first one, so Heidi mentioned that we don't necessarily need more research on the negative impact of abortion restriction on women's health. Heidi, you provided a little bit of context to this already in your remarks. But what are the research areas that are most crucial to focus on moving forward? And it would be great to get perspectives on this, both in the US and folks in other contexts as well. So I don't know, Heidi, if you'd like to speak to that first, and if anybody else would like to add on their thoughts.
Sure. Yeah. I do think it's important to have research on the harms of these restrictions. There's different specifics in each location and geography, and we have to believe that there will be the people in place at some point who will be responsive to evidence and research. So I do think it's important. However, I also think, given that we know so much about the harms of these laws, and we do know some things about interventions such as these colleagues have described, of like that can increase access to safe abortion care, whether that's clinical or self-managed, that as researchers, there's a responsibility to be doing research that either provides that information or funds those interventions where possible, and to design research to basically measure in this context that we find ourselves. If we do this intervention, what is the impact? Measuring the positive benefits of some of these interventions to expand access, to build the case for greater funding and scaling and expansion of those interventions. And I think there's just something to say to is what those interventions should be and what they are, I think really has to be driven in terms of the US, globally, anywhere in the world, driven by the local communities. I think there's a huge range of legal risk, even within states in the United States, within regions and towns in other countries, depending on whether if it's a risk of criminalization, the specific people who are law enforcement, the networks, social networks that exist, people know their local context best and have the best ideas for navigating what is possible in their areas and what could be a solution. So that's not the only specific. I think there is like working locally and understanding what local solutions could be, and investing and measuring those would be my short-ish answer.
Would either of our other panelists like to add on to that? What research areas would be most crucial to focus on moving forward?
I'm not a researcher, so I'll just qualify my comments with that. I think research can be incredibly valuable. What I would actually like to see more than, and as Heidi said quite rightly, there is already a vast amount of knowledge through research, evidence-based, on the harms caused by such restrictions and the economic as well as individual impact of unsafe abortions. I think what, at least as civil society, what I see as our movements is really how do we best use these to transform policy conversations. You know, how are we shaping the discourse around safe abortion? Because sometimes, again, as Heidi said quite rightly, it all sounds like very doom and gloom and negative. How can we shift the conversation to a way that doesn't threaten people by sounding very radical and rights-based? Because let's face it, that is what threatens people. The idea that women are suddenly going to be able to figure out what to do with their own lives, and that's scary. How do we, not get stuck in only, oh, well, so many women are dying, oh, poor women, because again, I feel that's a narrative of victimhood, and somehow appealing to people's, again, it's a little bit of, paternalistic kind of, let's protect them, let's save them by doing so and so. So I feel somewhere, we need to find a balance between that in our advocacy. And I think that's really tricky, how to stay informed by evidence, which probably gives you more of the public health argument, but also bringing in the rights-based perspective and blending it in a way that's, I think, acceptable politically. Because I think, that's kind of what also happened at the ICPD, right? At least we were able to get abortion in the document, but we had to say safe where legal. And we had to kind of promise not to consider it a method of family planning, which is, it had to be done. But at least it got in the document. So somewhere I feel, research that supports that kind of push is what would be really wonderful to have. Thanks.
Just to echo so much of what Charles said on this issue, same thing in Africa. We would really like evidence-based research, especially on the numbers, not necessarily the numbers of people dying, numbers in relation to access. How can we guarantee access? How can we give access? How does that look like? And so whether it's access to the pills or access to safe abortion care, so having more narratives pushed in that direction, not what we'd call in Africa, voice shame. I'm so sorry, this is happening to you. More like, how can we then increase bodily autonomy? Having those kind of conversations and printed out at least in journals and articles, and people can look into that. And also talking about it from a cultural perspective, right? Demystifying it as just a medical issue. I was talking about impact, right? Impact on individuals. Even from a cultural perspective in Africa, that's extremely important, having those kind of narratives really written out. I was also thinking about something that Suchitra mentioned in relation to the ICFP, which is also having the public health conversation vis-a-vis the human rights conversation and ensuring that they're within one space, right? One space where we're not individualizing it's only a public health issue, it's only a human rights issue, it's both. Yes, it's a question of access, but it's also a question of a rights, right? Autonomy vis-a-vis health access. So ensuring that those two conversations exist in one space and then publishing work around that as well. I think that would be extremely beneficial to pushing this agenda forward.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is more focused on the legal and policy aspects, and it's a question in two parts. The first question is, has anybody done work on creating a legal distinction between hotlines, telehealth, and telemedicine, even just a paper or a memo? And the second part of the question is there organizing happening with bar associations?
Maybe I could take it from my perspective first, because it's a little bit legal, so I like that. So first and foremost, creating legal distinctions between the hotlines, telehealth, and telemedicine. I think there are there are currently a few publications, maybe from the Mama Network, you might want to look into, that then talk about the distinction between a hotline being specifically around access to information. That is what basically you'll find in a hotline. It's access to information, not necessarily legal medical information, because that falls within the paradigm of legal access and medical access, and that's a whole other issue. So you might find some conversations, or at least some written narratives around hotlines and access to health, for example, as a human rights issue, right? So in our country, we have access to information as a human rights issue because it's in our constitution. And so our narratives and our publications are on that. So you might find information on that. In relation to telemedicine, it's a little bit of a murky situation because we don't really have quite a bit on telemedicine on my end. So I'm not sure whether you would be able to find that information, but I'd be happy to go back and look through it and then probably give Farah, and then she can be able to figure out how we can get it to you. But for hotlines, for sure, there is definitely narratives that you can be able to find online. That talk about distinction, so to speak. Organizing happening within bar associations, that's an interesting question because just like any other issue, abortion is extremely polarizing even within the legal space, right? So whether it's a question of ethics or whether it's a question of morality, even in bar associations, nobody wants to really be associated with that particular conversation because there's still, of course, the narrative that it's illegal and there's no laws necessarily defining access to that. So within bar associations, we're having a bit of a challenge in my country and in African countries to try to bring in bar associations and get buy-in from bar associations. But what we're trying to do, for example, with the Mama Network, is that we are trying to ensure that we offer it as part of continuing practice development. So CPD, that's what we call it, because you have to do it every year. So if we create it as an issue for conversation within those parameters, then we can be able to partner with bar associations. So it's part of the continuing legal education that you must do every year. So partnering with that, I know we're doing it, at least we're pioneering it here in Kenya, but I know in Tanzania, we're trying to work with a network called Taula, and Taula is their version of also a bar association, and we're trying to work with them to see how we can then train their lawyers as well within the similar narrative. So it's a little bit complicated to work with bar associations, just like I said, because of the intricacies of trying to, the legalese behind it and how polarizing the conversation is, but we're pushing and we're hopeful and we're hoping that we're going to get there at some point. So yeah.
If I could just add something,
please.
So
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any articles which have given the legal distinction between those three, but I know that Women on Web has quite a few publications about their experience with, kind of blend of hotline and telemedicine in the way that they work. So they may be useful to people.
And I can step outside of my role as facilitator for a moment and provide a little bit of insight into what that looks like in the US context. So in terms of creating distinctions, well, so the distinctions already exist, right? Telemedicine, support for self-managed abortion, and medication abortion are different things. And so we do have guidance, if when how has guidance on our website, because in the immediate aftermath of the Dobbs decision, there was a lot of conflation between abortion with pills and self-managed abortion, and not every abortion with pills is a self-managed abortion, although people do self-manage the symptoms of the abortion, and not every self-managed abortion is an abortion with pills. And then there's a sort of additional nuance that not every, so telemedicine abortion is generally not considered or not within what we consider self-managed abortion because it is through an intermediary healthcare provider who's the one who provides the pills. So it's the question of whether or not the medications are self-sourced or the means to end a pregnancy are self-sourced, which makes this distinction that is incredibly legally salient, especially in the United States, because the risk profile for self-managed abortion versus a telehealth abortion in a place where it is lawful to provide telehealth abortions is very different. And so we work not only with end users through our helpline, but also through our technical assistance with people who are running hotlines like the miscarriage and abortion hotline, and other folks who are supporting people who self-manage their abortions. And then I would echo Wanjira's comment that it's a bit difficult to work with bar associations. So certainly there has been a sudden groundswell of support from bar associations in particularly liberal jurisdictions. I am the co-chair of the Sex and Law Committee of the New York City Bar Association. So certainly there's a lot that we're trying to do and support there. The San Francisco Bar Association. And then there has been some movement among large lawyering organizations. The American Bar Association, we helped them to pass a resolution opposing the criminalization of self-managed abortion last year. The National Lawyers Guild beat them to it by 2 years. They supported decriminalization of self-managed abortion in 2018. But I think that what we recognized is that bar associations generally are they're professional organizations that look out for the good of lawyers, not necessarily for the good of justice, and not necessarily for the good of reproductive justice, which is why If When How has a reproductive justice lawyers network to serve as a political home for lawyers who are interested in making change around reproductive justice issues. And then they can take what they learn in the reproductive justice lawyers network and move that out to their local bar association so that we're really building the capacity of people to be able to advocate within their own bar association. So a little bit on the US context. So the next question that we have, the question says, this week, the New York Times Magazine featured an article on aid access and other hotlines and the legal risks to clinicians as well as shield laws. It seems that even in states which are supportive of access, there's a lack of interest in these protections. How can we promote uptake of these laws?
I mean, I think it's Farah and the lawyers on the call can probably speak better to that, but to the role of research, I think there's something in getting evidence to advocates and people who can make the case. There's this long chain of things that seem to lead to political change, which is not a linear path, it's a slow path. But I often feel that policy is catching up to advocacy, and it takes a long time of beating a drum to get a message across. And I think some of the research we've talked about on the harms of this, but also the benefits of expanded access to abortion might help make the case for some of this.
If I might take it a little bit from an African context, one of the biggest challenges we are having is having organic conversations around, for example, use of hotlines and risk and so on and so forth. So whereas there might be some form of jurisprudence or maybe learning experience in this particular article, I'm 50-50 about how I would want to have a conversation around this here, because I would like us to maybe use it to create generic and organic conversations here. So it's contextualized to what's happening to, in African countries and African states, and how does it affect our law. So if I might kind of loop in what Dr. Heidi was talking about in relation to the Dobbs case and how that has impacted Africa and how that has impacted us directly, it has shown us that a lot of times what comes out from these jurisdictions might not necessarily be very beneficial to us on this end. It might end up criminalizing it a little bit more because our contexts are not as open. So I think there's also going to be a bit of caution when we look about how to push for the uptake of these laws here. I think it's the question of just ensuring that we can domesticate it, which is what I had said earlier, into a more organic setting. So that's how I would think about it if it was to be in my context.
So I guess maybe I will pose one just final question. Is there anything that you would like to share with us as we close out? Anything, the most important takeaway that you would like our viewers today to carry with them? And we'll go again in the same order. So Suchitra, you first.
Thanks, Farah. So I'd actually made a note, and I'm glad you asked this question. Is that the WHO, which, in March 2020 came up with their guidance on self-managed healthcare. In fact, I saw what they had written, and their slogan says self-care interventions improve autonomy. And I think that's absolutely true, even for self-managed abortions using pills, which is what we would like. But that is also, I think, what creates the threatening sense, which creates the opposition and the restriction. So somehow to find a way to navigate path through that is really, I think, because it is not just a health issue, it's not just a legal issue. It's something far bigger than that, really speaking. And I think the politics of it needs to engage with the larger context within which we are seeking self-managed abortions. Thanks.
Thank you. Heidi?
Yeah, I think with the framing of the conversation, I leave with restrictions do drive some self-managed abortion, but self-managed abortion has always been here, will always be here. It's and understanding moving forward, understanding local solutions and figuring out how to invest in and expand, and as a researcher study the benefits of those solutions, even within this restrictive policy context, and how we can navigate around that.
Thank you so much. And why don't you please close us out?
Oh, brilliant. I like to be the last person, just to encourage us a lot to maybe engage more in Global South dialogues. I think it's extremely important for us to learn from jurisdictions that have been engaging with this much more than we have. And so even when you're doing your research, and even when you're looking into abortion care and you're looking into SME, I think it would be fantastic to have conversations with you through a Global South perspective, maybe partner with us, come talk to us, and talk to you, and we can share. Sharing is caring, as they always say. So it's important for us to kind of learn from your context, and you can also learn from the Global South context as well. So yeah.
Thank you. Sharing is caring. Thank you all. Thank you for those pearls right there at the end. We have reached the end of our time together, but I hope that everybody who's with us today has gotten some fresh perspectives and gleaned some new understandings and found some inspiration. And I hope that you'll join us for the remaining webinars in our series, and have a wonderful day.